Good evening and thank you. It's a pleasure indeed to have Ira back at Sarmaya. We are so proud when people come back. Ira was here talking about her other books earlier. The current book has just recently been launched, and it's a fascinating assessment, deeply researched, about what happened to Awadh as a consequence of the games the colonial powers were playing in Europe. So Ira is a best-selling writer of narrative history. She is the author of Akbar, the Great Mughal, and you will see all those books placed there. Song of Draupadi, a novel, and Daughters of the Sun and Heroines. Her latest book, The Lion and the Lily, examines the rise and fall of Awadh in the context of the global Franco-British wars. She writes rigorously researched and narrative histories that are accessible to the lay reader. And it's amazing, Awadh is one example, but there are many other examples of similar situations in Indian history where the French-British equations changing left some people high and dry at this end. People like Tipu Sultan, for example, suddenly the French were with him and suddenly they weren't. And that was the end of that dynasty. And Awadh is another incredible example of how those games that were being played overseas were having big impact to the extent of even dynasties getting extinguished as a consequence. So, Ira, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul. I hope everyone can hear me. Excellent. I'm really delighted to be here again. As Paul was saying, this is actually my second time here. And this time it is in this beautiful space which Paul and Pavitra have created together. And it is such a privilege, really, and an honor to be in a space that celebrates learning, beauty, art, culture, all of these, ephemeral things that are very hard to put a value on, but which are rare today, and it's wonderful to see people turn out to come and hear this exchange of ideas. So I'll begin with telling you that, as Paul was saying, till now I had written about the period which pretty much ended in the 16th century. My last book was pretty much ends in the 16th century. And beginning to look at the 18th century, it was almost as if somebody had switched the TV set from an old Agatha Christie movie to an Avengers movie suddenly. Not that I don't like Agatha Christie, they're wonderful. But just the action is so much faster paced, and the color is technicolor, and people are forming alliances. It's very hard to follow the action. Things are happening all over the place. So the 18th century really beguiled me by the amount of things that were happening in it when I started to look at it, and also by how much of what we had been told was untrue about the 18th century. Because as we all know, our history has been written to a great deal by the colonists. So we were left with the history as it was written by the victors of the colonial wars, which is the British. So we often have the impression, certainly in terms of art history, in terms of the Mughals, we have an impression of the 18th century being a long period of sort of just degenerance of the Mughal Empire, of a time in which little by little, in this very pathetic way, the Mughals just gave up on their power and things just slowly fell to pieces around them, and the entire country sort of entered this state of languor and waited for somebody to save them from this state, which was the colonial powers. But the more you look at the country at this time, the more you begin to understand that really wasn't the case. The 18th century was very exciting. It is true that in the beginning of the 18th century, we do see that the structural problems that had entered the Mughal Empire from the time of Aurangzeb, when he overextended the empire so much. So these sort of structural problems had entered the empire, and there was a beginning of a loss of power at the center. But what we start to see at this time is also the so-called sub-imperial states, like Mysore, like Paul was talking about, like Hyderabad, like the Rajasthan states, Murshidabad, and Awadh, many other states like this, beginning to take advantage of the lack of power at the center and beginning to stake a claim for legitimacy, stake a claim to form their own powerful centers, cultural centers in opposition to both the Mughals in Delhi and the encroaching colonial powers. So that is to give you a little bit of an overview of what was happening, that there were a lot of exciting things happening, as well as this action at the center in Delhi where the Mughal emperor was really struggling to hold on to power. And one of the very exciting things, of course, apart from what was happening within India in and of itself with indigenous powers, were the Anglo-French wars that Paul was talking about, to us about. Now, right through the 18th century, there are these huge wars that are taking place overseas, a lot of them very, very far away in America, like during the American Revolutionary Wars of 1778. Of course, the very famous 7 Years' War, which have a huge impact on Franco-British relations in India because of the truce that happened at the end of those wars means that France has to relinquish all its possessions in India. So despite them being in quite a powerful position in India at that time. So it's very interesting to see how many of these actions which are taking place thousands of miles away by powers who have never seen India, nothing to do with India, are having a huge repercussion on the ground in India. So I try to bring this, slightly forgotten aspect of Indian history within the story as I tell the story of Awadh. And of course, the great Napoleonic Revolutionary Wars in the end. So an important takeaway from these ideas is that India was really a cosmopolitan place in the 18th century. You have neighboring Persia, which is slowly crumbling because it is also facing a lot of internal problems, and you have a lot of Persian immigrants coming into India at this time. You have a lot of Afghans, as the nation is created, who start coming into India as well. You know that Ahmad Shah Abdali starts coming almost on a yearly journey into India, treating it almost like his piggy bank. Whenever he's out of money, he just comes into Delhi to loot it and take some treasure back. You have the Rohillas who form their state. You have, of course, a whole bunch of Europeans, apart from the British. You have the French, you have the Portuguese, and all these sort of different nationalities are creating a different influence in their own way and having an effect on the local polities at that time. So to begin the story more or less that I cover, it begins at the Battle of Buxar. Now we often think that the Battle of Plassey, in 1757 when Robert Clive, of course, as we know, enters Bengal, we think that that is really the formative battle of the century. But really the Battle of Buxar is a really, really important one for the consequences that it has on the shape of India. So what we have at this time is the central character here of Nawab Shuja-ud-Dawla. So he is the third Nawab of Awadh. He's a very young man at the time of Battle of Buxar. He's in his 20s because his father Safdarjung dies unexpectedly. He is something of a playboy at this time, a connoisseur of ladies. He has been caught in his teenage years twice climbing up the walls of a young woman's house and taken to the Kotwal because of that. He enjoys a reputation as a ladies' man, as somebody who enjoys courtesans, music and dance. Kite flying is one of his occupations. Hunting, he loves the hunt. So we have this, this idea of really a man who is enjoying his youth, and he's apparently very strapping and tall, and everybody is seduced by him because he has this wonderful personality. Apart from which he has these glorious moustaches, which I feel are the real key to his success with the ladies. So Nawab Shuja-ud-Dawla is a young man to whom no reverses have happened at all at this stage because he was born into the Nawabi family. They were already established in Awadh at this time. So he has it handed to him on a platter. He rather has a good opinion of himself because he has won every battle he has undertaken until then, not too many, it's true, but he has a very good opinion of himself. So when his other allies, like Mir Qasim of Bengal, who knows what's happening in Bengal, who has had a taste of the British, tries to tell him, listen, let us try and coordinate our strategy, military strategy to attack the British. He says, no, leave it to me, I know much better than you, I have it all sorted. So he's really overconfident at this point. We have the poor Emperor Shah Alam II. Now he is a figure who is, of course, really tragic in the end because we know the unhappy fate that is in wait for him. He is blinded in the end by somebody he had fostered as a child. And he is really pretty much a pensioner king of the British. But at this time, he too is a young man. He too has dreams and ambitions of reconquering Delhi, the great seat of his ancestors. So he rides out of Delhi because his life is under threat at that time from the Marathas. So he escapes Delhi, he escapes the Lal Killa, and he looks for help. And who does he look for help first? Is Shuja-ud-Dawla, who is the most powerful man at this time, the man with the biggest army, the best reputation as a courageous man of action. So we have these gentlemen here, and we have unexpectedly a Frenchman, because as I was telling you, at the end of the 7 Years' War, the French had to actually give up all their possessions in Pondicherry, in Chandannagar, all the other factories that they had. So all the officers at this time, the Frenchmen, are looking for employment. They go from state to state to see who has the resources to employ them. And this gentleman, Jean-Baptiste Gentil, who is the agent of the French king at this time, he ends up in Awadh because Nawab Shuja-ud-Dawla again has the best resources and he employs him. So we have this pretty strong party on the one hand. You would think there are 200,000 men under Shuja-ud-Dawla at this point, so he's pretty confident. When he hears talk of the power of the British, he will hear nothing of it because he had had no direct encounters with them, and he thinks that they are these slightly dirty, slightly grasping foreigners on the edge of the empire, because as of now they're still only at the borders in Calcutta or in Bombay or in Madras, so he doesn't think very much of them at all. Unfortunately, we all know how the battle pans out. Of those 200,000 men, very few are actually fighting men. Most are actually camp followers. Most are actually cavalry. The cavalry is still quite powerful, but the infantry is really ineffective because they are unmotivated men who are paid 7 or 8 rupees, and they have very little skin in the game, so they're not great soldiers at all. In the end, there are only 40,000 fighting men. Out of which one party is headed by a Frenchman. There's Jean-Baptiste Gentil, and there's another one whom we will come across a little bit later. So the Frenchmen do pretty well. They carry out their campaigns quite well. They do themselves relative honor. But a lot of the other battles are a complete fiasco and a shambles, and the battle is lost by the Mughal party. So for the first time in his life, Shuja-ud-Dawla is defeated roundly. And this is a moment of real angst for him because he has never faced such a turnaround in his situation. He has never been beaten before. And in this case, he is completely beaten. His lands are taken away from him. He becomes a refugee. During the battle, which is taking place, he had left his wife and his mother at the fort of Allahabad, which is an Akbar era fort which still stands today, though in a far lesser state than it was then. He leaves the ladies there, and he starts, basically he's an exile and a refugee, and he's really, really desperate at this point. And what happens is that this famous Diwani is signed over to the British. I'm sure you will be familiar with this very famous episode where the British basically browbeat the poor Shah Alam, his forces have been defeated therefore. They take him to the fort of Allahabad and they force him to sign over the Diwani, which means that he hands over the revenue collecting rights to the British. So now they have the right to collect revenue from the most prosperous state of India. Bengal and Bihar, all of that comes until now. This is the first time that they get the right to do that. So this is why this is a really important moment in the fall of the Mughal Empire, in the way Hindustan will be shaped altogether. So Shah Alam does this unhappily, but he is forced to do this. But we have Jean-Baptiste Gentil here, who is involved in the negotiations with the British officers. And what he does at this point is very important to Shuja-ud-Dawla because he brings Shuja-ud-Dawla and the British to the table. And he says, listen, for the British in Bengal, Awadh is still a very important place because it's this huge swathe of North India from Delhi to Bengal. This entire northern region is what was called Awadh, today broadly speaking UP. So he tells the British, you will never be able to rule and govern an area this large, so far away from Calcutta. Hand it over to Shuja-ud-Dawla and he will give you something in return. And of course, there's something in return that they ask for is a huge amount of money. they asked for a war indemnity of 50 lakhs of rupees, for that time an enormous sum. So Shuja-ud-Dawla is desperate. None of his allies come to him. They all, pretend to be broke at this stage. Shuja-ud-Dawla is definitely broke after this war, which has lasted for months, almost a year. But at the last minute, his wife comes to him, Bahu Begum. Bahu Begum of Awadh is a woman who's descended from a famous Delhi family. So she's very familiar with Delhi, with the Delhi court, the Mughal court. So she's a really elite woman herself, and she comes to Shuja-ud-Dawla. She's had a very grand wedding, so she has a huge, enormous trousseau. And she comes to him with her jewelry, with whatever she has lying around her, pots and pans and silver and gold, all the expensive clothes that she has. It is said she even takes off the nut from her nose and hands it to Shuja-ud-Dawla and says, "Without you, I am nothing, so take everything I have." This will completely change the dynamic that Shuja-ud-Dawla has with Bahu Begum. Because till now, as I mentioned, he was a bit of a ladies' man. He was used to many courtesans, enjoying the company of courtesans. We never hear of Bahu Begum before this point. But after this point, he calls her in his own records his best friend and his confidant. He will entrust her with all the secrets of his state. He will entrust her with all the excess revenue that he has. So whenever he's paid his dues, paid his people, done everything that he needs to do, whatever he has excess, he hands over to Bahu Begum, making her the single richest person in Awadh. So this entirely changes Bahu Begum's dynamic with him, of course, because they jointly now will found a court in Faizabad, but it will also change the status she has later on vis-a-vis the British. So a very important moment here, which is, to our great delight, painted for us in this wonderful collection. So Jean-Baptiste Gentil, when he comes to India, when all in all, I think he spends 25 years in India. It is said by his biographer when he goes back home to France, because he is one of the rare men who does manage to go back with his wife and his children, that he is more Indian than he was French at that point. But what I like to remark about Jean-Baptiste Gentil is that he always remains, when he's shown in his pictures, in his French officer's uniform. He's never shown wearing Indianized Nabobi style clothes that we will see some of the other gentlemen wear. He remains the French king's agent to the Nawab. But what he does do in his 12 years employed with Shuja-ud-Dawla, so Shuja-ud-Dawla pays him very well to train his soldiers. And you will see here, this is actually a depiction of all the soldiers lined up neatly on their horses. And Shuja-ud-Dawla is on a horse in the middle, and in the blue jacket is Jean-Baptiste Gentil reaching up to Shuja-ud-Dawla to present all these Frenchmen to him, and Shuja-ud-Dawla takes on all these Frenchmen. So for the 12 years that Jean-Baptiste Gentil is in Awadh, in Faizabad basically at this time, he spends a lot of money and time creating one of the greatest late 18th century collections of art that we have. Because this is a time in which there is chaos at Delhi. There has been death and destruction. There has been Ahmed Shah Abdali carrying out yearly raids. There has been Nadir Shah before him. So there's all sorts of chaos happening in Delhi. The Mughal emperor, as we have seen, is in exile. At the moment, he is still in Allahabad, held there by the British. So there's nobody in Delhi to patronize art. There's nobody to patronize the artists, the poets, the dancers, the singers, the musicians. How will they all survive without money? On love for a little while, but eventually you do need money. So all of this talent, this great Mughal talent that has been fostered for centuries in traditions carried on from father to son and so on, slowly starts moving to the so-called sub-imperial centers. And you begin to see Mughal artists, Mughal poets, Mughal painters drifting into these places where there are patrons. So one of the important centers is Awadh. There are others, of course. There's Murshidabad. There are the Rajput courts who start producing beautiful art, but there is definitely Awadh. So because these artists are available to Jean-Baptiste Gentil, he patronizes a collection of amazing albums which today lie either at the Paris Bibliothèque Nationale, and some of them are in England. Unfortunately, we don't have access. Many of them have not been digitized. Many of them we don't have access to easily in India. So I'm really happy to share some of this art with you, because some of this will not have been seen by a wider audience before. So you see the beginning actually of what will later on be called company art. I'm sure you all, Paul of course is an absolute expert, but what is called company art actually comes up about 20 years later under the British. But here I would like to point out, as Mildred Archer, the art historian, has said, you see it 20 years earlier in Faizabad under a Frenchman. So he has done the same thing, create art using Mughal artists, Indian trained artists, with a European gaze, because he wants them to say something about his life. He wants them to say something that he will take and interpret to the king of France and to an elite French audience. So he sometimes writes his little notes in French on the manuscripts, telling us what these things are. And these are the colors that are typically used. Those of you who are familiar, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Mughal art, much more vibrant, much more color. This is the more subdued, muted tone, which will be very characteristic later on of company art. So people like the Indophile Jean-Marie Lafont has suggested that we remove this name, company art, for this art at least, and call it the Faizabadi School of Art. Because company art is anyway a little bit of a troublesome name, because it gives all the onus to the patrons, and we forget about the Indian artists altogether. So he has suggested, and I agree with him, that for this body of work that is created at Faizabad at this time, we call it the Faizabadi School of Art. So here is a lovely specimen. I wanted to point out, yes, earlier in this wonderful meeting that Shuja-ud-Dawla is having with the British, where they agree to hand him back his lands as long as he pays them the war indemnity, there's a little dog. And that little dog is often present in many of these Jean-Baptiste Gentil paintings. And I'm interested in, I'm always talking about alternative narratives, alternative points of view. I would like to know if he's written a biography somewhere. Now that would be really interesting. So here you see again, as I was pointing out. So now we come to the crux of the story, which is Shuja-ud-Dawla and his son Asaf-ud-Dawla. So once the treaties are signed after the Battle of Buxar, Shuja-ud-Dawla comes back to Faizabad. That is the first capital that he sets up with Bahu Begum. And he starts attracting all these artists, including a European one. So this is Tilly Kettle, who is one of the first of the British artists, again lured by the great money and the great resources of the Nawab. And he paints this stunning oil painting, and I think till then they would never have seen the Nawab. So I write about it in my book, that what must the Nawab have made of this painting, in which he is shown so lifelike, because as you will know, in Mughal art you normally show the elite and the imperial people with this aura of magnificence around them. We don't show them as human beings with human frailties and human weaknesses. But here you can see that they are all too human. You can see the folds of the cloth so beautifully drawn in perspective, and you can see the shadows, and you can see the expression on the faces. And his son Asaf-ud-Dawla will be belittled consistently by the British when they interact with him from 1775 onwards, because by now they're very desperate to get the treasure that Awadh promises. And so they write about him in really derisory terms. They call him lazy, pampered, crude, obscenely fat, all of which, is completely untrue when you look at the Indian sources and the French sources together. So I really like this painting, because you see Asaf-ud-Dawla look at his father and you wonder about his expression, because Shuja-ud-Dawla has this great reputation, as a man, just a man's man, just so unbelievably powerful that he can kill a buffalo with a single stroke of the sword, apparently. A bit of a show-off, I think he was. So it's wonderful to have this painting. This painting actually ends up in France, because it is made for Nawab Shuja-ud-Dawla, but Shuja-ud-Dawla then gets his artists, his local artists, to copy it. He's very interested in having this tradition carried on and to see what his own Indian artists can make of this oil painting. So he gets some wonderful copies made, and Jean-Baptiste Gentil also gets a copy made, and when he shows it to Shuja-ud-Dawla, Shuja-ud-Dawla takes Jean-Baptiste Gentil's copy and gives it away to another officer. And Jean-Baptiste Gentil is really outraged and said, how could you do this? How will I... so there's some very nice interaction that happens, and Shuja-ud-Dawla tells him, but I am always in your heart. What need do you have of a painting of me to represent me when you go to Paris? And he says, Jean-Baptiste Gentil replies, yes, but I cannot take it out of my heart to show it to people, so I do need a painting of yours, which is a fair point. So, having had the Indian painting taken away from him, he demands this one. And Shuja-ud-Dawla gives it to him, which is why this painting by Tilly Kettle actually hangs at Versailles today. This I wanted to show you the cast of characters, some of whom are in my book, to show you that this was a really cosmopolitan place, a cosmopolitan culture, where our ideas of nation, loyalty, patriotism really don't hold water at all. And I like to use the analogy, a sporting analogy, which I have never done before, but is very apt in this case. We tend to think of nations as belonging to an Olympic team, to having one flag, one national anthem, one set of loyalties. But actually in those days, it was more like belonging to the IPL, that you basically paid for whoever paid you most. So a lot of these characters are fighting on the behalf or at the court of people who have really nothing to do with sense of loyalty at all. So the only one that I think some of you may know about is Claude Martin to the top right. So Claude Martin, famous by Lamartinière schools all over the world, especially in Lucknow. So he is a Frenchman, he is a bona fide Frenchman, he speaks French, he speaks terrible English. I've seen his writings, they are really, really terrible. Grammar is all over the place, and yet at the first chance that he has in Pondicherry, when Pondicherry is taken over by the Brits, he defects to the British immediately because he sees that he will have greater gains with the British. And his entire career is based with the British, despite speaking, as I said, such terrible English that the British sneer at him. They're quite snobbish. The group of British who implanted in India at that time, at least in Lucknow, are very, conscious of who is speaking. They're very snobbish. And they treat him pretty poorly, but he stays. He insists that he is a British officer. So you have Claude Martin there. Below him you have René Madec, who is also a bona fide Frenchman, and who, to his credit, doesn't go over to the British, but he fights his entire career for the Jats. He makes a fortune fighting for the Jats, who are coming up in the north in Hindustan at this time. At the bottom is the famous painter of this epoch, Johann Zoffany. He is an Anglo-German painter, and he is a great friend with Claude Martin because both of them speak very poor English. So that draws them together. You have Benoit de Boigne, who is from the Chambéry region of what is today France, but in those days was an independent duchy. So he had no need to ally himself to France or to Britain, and he fights with a great deal of success and honor for the Marathas. He is actually the head of their brigades in the Hindustan. He becomes a very, very famous and wealthy man due to his battles under the Marathas. And finally, we have Antoine Collier to the top left, who is, so you have this writer called Maya Jasanoff, who has written a wonderful book of, detailing these characters also to some extent, and she calls them chameleons, shapeshifters, and social climbers. And really, Antoine Collier exemplifies all of those things. So despite belonging to a French origin family from Lausanne, which is today in Switzerland, he also goes over to the Brits because he's a Protestant. So thanks to his Protestantism, he is able to find a commonality of purpose with the British, though he does admit that there is a limit to how much they will let him rise in the service because of his suspicious French lineage. So this is a little bit to give you an idea of these very loose characters who were hanging around the courts. So another wonderful document I wanted to share with you is again a Jean-Baptiste Gentil patronized atlas. So this atlas is a fantastic thing because at this point we don't have anything like topographical maps. So Jean-Baptiste Gentil creates an album of 21 sobas delineating the 21 sobas of India based on Abu al-Fazl's writing. Abu al-Fazl, of course, being the famous biographer of Akbar in the 16th century. So he uses Abu al-Fazl's work, adds to it his own knowledge from traveling around the countryside, adds bits like topographical bits like the little hills and mountains, rivers which have never been noted before. He puts in little ponds and things. And unfortunately, though this is a remarkable document for the 1770s, nothing like it exists for that time, it was somehow completely ignored. He made a gift of it to the King of France, but as we know, 1789 was an unfortunate time for the head of the King of France. And so it wasn't given, it was sort of forgotten and fell by the wayside. But it's a beautiful document, and I want to show with you that apart from the actual place names and the geographical bits, he adds vignettes according to what he thinks that area symbolizes or what is active, what is happening in those places. So this, in his eccentric French spelling, is Shahjahanabad, which is Old Delhi, which is Old Delhi today in Delhi, which was, of course, New Delhi at that time. It is the seat of Mughal power. So what is fabulously interesting and has been pointed out by a young scholar called Chanchal Dadlani is that he has shown all the attributes of an insignia of royalty on the lower right, because Shahjahanabad is where the Mughal emperor should be. This is the seat of his power. So you see the nakkar, all the instruments that should be part of the royal orchestra which beat to announce his arrival. You can see the insignia, you can see the banners. All of these are the royal insignia with the fish symbol, with the lion symbol. You have the throne over there, but it is empty. There is nothing happening there. They are just lying as if in a museum. Whereas, if you look at the Subah of Awadh, look at the activity happening here. Look at how much information we have about the people, and look at this beautiful scene of a hunt. Now this is a scene, and I can't focus too much here because this is not a very high-res image. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France unfortunately makes you pay a great deal for high-res images, and so I couldn't get too many of these. But here you see Shuja-ud-Dawla taking part in a lion hunt. Now what is a lion hunt? A lion hunt at that time was a sign of imperial grandeur. It was often an animal that only royalty could hunt. Only the elite were allowed to hunt. From Akbar's time, only the emperor was allowed to hunt lions. So you see, Shuja-ud-Dawla is involved in a royal pastime, whereas the one of Shahjahanabad is completely empty. So this is very interesting that he is making, there's a subtext here going on. There's a coda that you need to understand so that you can really comprehend the message he is giving and the message that he intends to give to the King of France when he goes back, and an elite audience of Frenchmen who theoretically will be observing these beautiful manuscripts. But where is Shah Alam in all of this, since he is not in Shahjahanabad? I found him here in the Subah of Ajmer. So I just took a little section. This is the section to the top. At the bottom you have the Subah of Ajmer in cartographical sort of form. But you see that here Shah Alam is sitting under his royal parasol, and he is receiving the blessing of the Pirzada of Ajmer. So very interesting here that he has gone and to receive the blessing from a Sufi saint, whereas his own power at the center in Delhi is being questioned. I have never come across any story related to these episodes where Shah Alam is having to go to Ajmer and seek the blessings of the Pirzada over there. So very interesting how this today obscure Frenchman is giving us information to what actually has been happening in the 18th century all along. And a beautiful image of the Nakkar as well over here. Now to come to art, because we also have this great efflorescence of art at this time. This is an artist known as Faizullah, an Indian artist, Mughal trained artist who has come to Awadh. And we have this whole series of paintings in this style, this so-called terrace scenes. And when they first were observed and written about in great detail 30 or 40 years ago, the art historians would write about it in fairly critical terms. That, the Indian artists have seen all of this, European art, they've seen the oil painting, they've seen all the great books which have been arriving in India, and they are just not understanding perspective. They're not understanding truth perspective, because if you see here, there are actually multiple perspectives. There's not a single bird's eye perspective. You have one showing some sort of idealized vista in the distance, right under that arch. You have other scenes happening from different points of view, converging at different angles. So this is not something which is realistic, let us say. It's not something which could actually exist. But as Kavita Singh, the great art historian who so sadly passed away last year, has explained so beautifully, she said that there's another way of looking at this art. And it is that the Indian artists, of course, they have understood perspective, but they have appropriated it and they're using it to sort of give us a completely different point of view, to give us a very different message for which we need to break down the codes. And what this Indian artist is showing is that there is this beautiful idealized space that the nawabs and begums are inhabiting and have created. It's the space where music, where culture, where dance and art can exist, because now these are royal habits that they have brought into Awadh. And this lady in the middle down there, the dancing lady, is balancing a flask of wine on her head. And what else do you wish to do with great art than balance a flask of wine on your head? Whereas all the heavy duty labor and all the dirty tasks are relegated to the distant, to the far distance. So in the far distance you will see people with pickaxes, digging, building, and all the sort of laborious processes are pushed to the distance. And right in the distance, I've cropped and given you a slightly enlarged bit in the top. There you see a royal procession in the very far distance. And Kavita Singh has said that if you study them very carefully, that elephant carrying a royal figure followed by many soldiers and paraphernalia of war, it looks a lot like some of the images from the Shahnama, and possibly this is meant to depict Shah Alam and Mughal politics. So what the artist is doing, in tune with his patron, is to push Delhi politics far away in the distance. Delhi politics, which has brought them nothing but grief, which caused Shuja-ud-Dawla so much trauma and grief in 1764, that is relegated far in the distance below the hazy clouds, whereas all this area of beauty is what the nawabs are creating. And there are many paintings in that style. I got obsessed with these at one point, Paul. I was just gathering them in an album, they're so beautiful. Another painting which I found spectacular, also by Jean-Baptiste Gentil, and he's written, what's really fun also is that he's written an accompanying page describing what is happening, and he's saying that this has been happening in the 1770s, ever since Shuja-ud-Dawla comes to Faizabad and settles his court here. He carries out this procession of Muharram, and I haven't seen any other earlier source telling us about such a large-scale procession that is taking place, and here it is in Faizabad. You see these long lines of this kind of style, where the top figures are smaller than the ones closest to us, are obviously meant to show distance. So this huge procession is going through the city with all these elephants. In the middle is an elite gathering of the Nawab and his courtiers, all engaged in this procession. You see the taziyas being carried out, and they are all glimmering and glinting with the gold that they are covered in. And it is really a very fabulous procession that is being carried out. And we have from here the first intimation of the sort of Shia Renaissance that will be carried out by his son and heir Asaf-ud-Dawla in Lucknow. What we also have from Jean-Baptiste Gentil's little vignettes here and there, if you take them out of their main folios and piece them together, you really get an idea of what Shah Alam the Emperor is up to. And like art historian Chanchal Dadlani has pointed out, that this is one of the only places that we have that in Jean-Baptiste Gentil's albums. Nobody else tells us what Shah Alam is up to in these turbulent times. What is he actually doing? What does he look like? What is going on around him? So if you remember the Ajmer one, already we have an idea of him going to Ajmer, seeking the blessings of the Pirzada. Here, while he is still in Allahabad, he comes away at some point in 1769, looking for help from Shuja-ud-Dawla. And here we have Jean-Baptiste Gentil in his elegant red coat, reaching up to greet Shah Alam. And Shah Alam wants to ask Shuja-ud-Dawla to help him get back to Delhi. He's desperate to get back to his capital city, desperate to get back to his family. Only a few of his family members are with him in Allahabad. His heir and some of his mother, I think, is still in Delhi. So he comes to Shuja-ud-Dawla, who of course is very gracious, very hospitable, but in his own diplomatic way says, no way am I getting involved in Delhi politics again. So we have this lovely image because Jean-Baptiste Gentil writes in his memoirs that Shah Alam wanted me to come with him, and I had to refuse because I was employed by Shuja-ud-Dawla. So both these men preferring to stay far away from the poor Shah Alam. This is Antoine Collier. If you remember, this is the gentleman whom I said was the most suspect in terms of where his loyalties lay. And he was pretty much, I think if you piece together the information, pretty much a spy for everybody, So he came to India at the age of 15 and joined the British directly, claiming that their Protestant religion brought a commonality of purpose. He very cleverly changed his name from Antoine to Anthony to make it more anglicized. But he also has this double life where in Awadh, he finally ends up through a fairly circuitous road back in Awadh as an engineer and architect. And while he is at the court, he also sometimes enjoys having himself painted as a nawab. You know, the returning Europeans who went back with this sort of lifestyle and these sort of clothes were called nawabs. And he enjoys having himself painted like an elite gentleman of Awadh. He also enjoys the lifestyle, including several bibis, Indian bibis and courtesans. He is a great aficionado of dance and music, and we have his letters, and they have been translated recently, and we see him giving direction to his wives, to his bibis, saying, have you made sure that the dancers have learned such and such piece? So he's really invested in Indian culture. He really does seem to enjoy and love what he sees around him to a great extent, but he remains an English officer as well, because that's where the money also lies. And he is sending out his spies to the Mughal court in Delhi. He's sending them out to the court of Najaf Khan, who is the great courtier of Mughal Delhi at this time. He has spies with Shuja-ud-Dawla, with Asaf-ud-Dawla, with the ladies. He has spies everywhere. So a very talented man, all in all. And he returns to France with a great deal of money, leaves his bibis and children behind, abandons them really. And I think Claude Martin, who must have felt some guilt on his behalf, looks after the children, and at least one of them we have tracked down. One dies, I believe, and one has been tracked down, having been sent to Europe to get a proper European education. So what happens of the art when they see those beautiful oil paintings of Shuja-ud-Dawla? Because we know that Shuja-ud-Dawla encourages his local artists to look at those paintings, and they come up with something quite different. So if you compare this with Tilly Kettle, you can see how the Indian artist is loath to show his, his ruler devoid of all the accoutrements of royalty. So he has put an elephant in the background, he has given him a nice big bow, he has given him 2 attendants who are going to chase away the flies. So he has set him in a much more Mughal setting, even though he has obviously learned a lot about shade and light and perspective and depth and weight from looking at the oil painting. So I really love these paintings. So this one was patronized by Antoine Collier, because Jean-Baptiste Gentil is one. The second greatest collection of Indian art of the late 18th century is owned by Antoine Collier. So for all his shortcomings as a man and as a not very loyal person, he has a great collection of art, and it is the most complete set that exists today, because it ended up in Berlin. It was bought up by a collector in Berlin, I think in the 19th century, and in the Islamic Museum in Berlin. It is a beautiful, beautiful collection, some of which I have been able to get from them. So you can see them here. You can see his. So if you want to do, I can teach you a good party trick, if you want to ever pretend to recognize a Collier album just at first sight like this, is that he always has these double borders. There's blue border here and an inner blue border. He always has a double border, and in the middle, this efflorescence of flowers, this sort of, scrolling vine of colorful flowers. So all his albums have this sort of border. You can see them exactly the same, double blue border. And don't forget this, you never know who you can impress with this kind of trick. So to tell you how his art also reflected his changing loyalties, his changing, the changing currents in India at this time. So initially the art he patronizes is classical Indo-Islamicate style, Mughal style art. That is the sort of information he wants to keep. It is all the paintings we are very familiar with, of rulers, of beautiful maidens, the classic Mughal trope. But slowly, just as the Oriental society is coming up in Calcutta and in Lucknow, he becomes a member of that society, and William Jones is of course the British man who sets it up. And those men are now becoming more interested in Sanskrit, and in the art that talks more about the Hindu religion, the Hindu gods, the Hindu background. And he immediately changes his patronage. He puts away all the Indo-Persian art that he was patronizing till now, and he starts commissioning these great, beautiful paintings of Hindu gods and goddesses. He also starts starts trying to learn Sanskrit, whereas till now he was very fluent in Persian. He starts to learn Sanskrit and starts collecting Sanskrit documents. He also gets hold of, it is believed to be one of the first copies of the Vedas that falls into European hands. He gifts a copy to William Jones and gifts a copy to the British Museum. That's how it ends up in England through a Frenchman. Another lovely painting which also shows up what is happening in parallel to the Mughal emperor. He finally gets an army to take him back to Delhi in around 1771-72, and it is not Shuja-ud-Dawla, it is the Marathas who finally agree to accompany him back to Delhi. They bring an army together, and you can see this wonderfully detailed image where over here in the foreground, it is obviously a noble woman who is in her covered palanquin, and around her are female guards. So very interesting to see this. We know that these female guards have existed since the time of Akbar, but it is really interesting to see them here painted. They are on horseback, they're carrying weapons, and they're these very strong looking women. You have the emperor on his royal mount, you have all the soldiers, the Marathas, you can make them out from their turbans. So a fascinating work of art, also commissioned by Jean-Baptiste Gentil. Now, I haven't spoken to you very much about Bahu Begum. We left her after she gave her nut to Shuja-ud-Dawla. But she becomes exceedingly powerful at this time, especially after the death of Shuja-ud-Dawla. So in 1775, Shuja-ud-Dawla dies and Asaf becomes Nawab. And in the and Asaf-ud-Dawla shifts to Lucknow and sets up his court. There are complicated reasons for that. I talk about it in the book. He sets up his court in Lucknow. And what is fascinating at this point in the 1780s is that there are three powers of influence. There is Asaf-ud-Dawla in Lucknow. There are the British who are now very much present in Awadh and who are trying to exert more and more pressure. But there are the begums in Faizabad. So there are three opposing centers of power because Bahu Begum and her mother-in-law Nawab Begum continue to live in Faizabad, continue to patronize scholars, philosophers, merchants, artists, painters, poets from Delhi. And they have their parallel court going on in Faizabad. And in the 1780s, England is in very dire straits because she has just lost her American colonies. Now for England, the loss of the American colonies because of French help, because I don't know how much you know about this, but the French were heavily involved in the American War of Independence. You have Lafayette, who is very famous in America because he was a French general who fought for them. The French are giving men and resources and materials to the Americans, and the Americans win their independence from the British. This is a moment of great angst for the British. They have always despised the French, but now they really loathe them, and they are desperate that from now on they will hold on to, no matter what happens, they must hold on to India because India will make up for the loss of America. So both the French and the British from the 1780s onwards become even more invested in India. We think the French sort of lose their ambitions at this point, but they don't. Their ambitions change. And because they have been so encouraged by the results in America, they are determined to do the same in India. They feel that if they encourage the rulers, the local rulers, with arms and men and ammunition, they can help them to overthrow what they see as the chains of oppression that the British have imposed on local rulers. So even though it doesn't work out for Tipu Sultan, originally that is what they are trying to do with Tipu in Mysore. It is what they try to do in Awadh to a certain extent. It's what they try to do in Delhi. So we see these little currents happening all the time, but Hastings, who is the Governor General at this time, writes to say that the minute I heard that America was lost and we needed money, because their national debt goes up by a huge amount at this time because of the loss of America. So they need to get money and they're going to get it from India. So Hastings comes to Lucknow at this time. He comes to Benares and tries to get money from that young Raja Chait Singh of Benares. He tries to impose an extra subsidy on him. The Raja refuses. Hastings shows up in Benares, imprisons him, and this results in a huge uprising in the entire countryside, which the begums are part of. They also participate. They send out their Khwajasaras, their eunuchs, to raise men, to raise troops for the Raja to fight against the British. So this is very much a forgotten aspect of Indian history. What happened at Benares, what happened in the Awadhi countryside way before 1857, way before Hazrat Mahal, for example. The women were already really involved. And it just shows how, despite being these parda-bound women, they are able to exercise so much influence and power that it is really something worth looking at to understand how they did this. This is just a picture to show you today. I don't have much time to talk about the buildings, but what was very interesting, we saw in the art the borders of scrolling vines and flowers. This is something that came up in buildings as well. This is very typical of Faizabadi and Lucknowi art. Is these huge, do you see these huge three-dimensional stucco flowers and leaves all around the Rumi Darwaza? This is something that you never saw in classical Mughal paintings or Mughal architecture in Delhi, for example, or anywhere else. It is something that came up in Awadh, and it is a way of usurping Mughal power, showing that yes, we will build arches, yes, we will build similar structures, we will build raised tombs, but we are doing our own thing in terms of decoration. And they start using lime stucco in such an exuberant and vital and unique manner that it becomes a calling card for all of Lucknowi and Faizabadi architecture. You will see it everywhere. So this is a painting of Asafudollah. I was talking about the Shia Renaissance that comes up at around this time. And these paintings show that he himself was involved in the commemorations of the Muharram. He builds the great Bada Mambara of Lucknow that some of you might be familiar with, which is entirely covered with the decoration that I was talking about. This painting shows him participating in that. These paintings, so this one is of Murshidabad, and I wanted to show you that, the Muharram processions were really a cultural melting pot for the entire citizenry to take part of. We have many written records which tell us that this was not Muslim. This was a cultural thing for the people who were involved. So you have, even in the taziyas, some look like Mughal tombs, but at the back, some look like temples, and some look like little mud huts, because everybody gets involved in these processions and in these commemorations which are being patronized in such a big way by the elite of these areas. So it becomes, something that binds all of people together, and the travelers who come through are very shaken by this, and they say it is all because Islam has reached a very weak state in India, that they have become so colorful, so full of pageantry, so full of noise and celebration. I brought this in just to make the little link with Bombay here, because this is a wonderful wood carving of a Muharram commemoration in 1878, and you will see that it is full of Hindus as well. You will see that they immerse the tazia in the water, which is something that Indians do in India with Ram Leela, with all the processions that happen here. So it is really a bringing together of the citizens of a place, and it is a bringing together in a very vital and active manner, because they cross the city. They walk through the important structures of a city, and this is something that will become very suspect to the British, because they don't like this huge mass of people moving through the city in such a sort of, in a manner that makes no sense to them. This sort of, commemoration with people who are hitting themselves, with blood also running during the Muharram, because that is part of the flagellation. This is something that the British find really abhorrent, inexplicable, and very difficult to understand. So it is something that they will really at this time pivot against and try to show in a more increasingly negative light. Whereas in Faizabad, for example, when I went to visit and see on the ground what was happening, there are still some beautiful buildings, and I wish there was a Paul Abraham in Faizabad to take over some of those structures, because they are being left to fall to absolute ruin, and they're stunning. But whereas they are of course all covered in the same identifiable stucco decorations, including the famous fish. I don't know if you will be familiar with the Mahi Maratib symbol of the fish. you also see them in the temples, because everyone is appropriating this symbolism which is beyond religion. It is about a shared culture. And similarly, the nawabs are also doing the same thing, in the sense that they are celebrating Diwali, they are celebrating Dussehra, they are also patronizing all the Hindu arts and celebrations and rituals, so that it really becomes a sort of melting point that brings everybody together. Here we see Asaf, a young Asaf Uddaulah celebrating Holi, I had one of Shujadullah, but I seem to have missed that. So I will leave that on that hopeful note, which is to bring out the fact that there was this great syncretic Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb which came up in Awadh at this time, and some of the impetus lies in these kind of celebrations and ambitions that the rulers have.
Subscribe to Sarmaya and be a part of the stories and conversations around art, history, and culture.